Elizabeth Holmes is in federal prison in Bryan, Texas. She was, by any measure, a fraud. She raised money under false pretenses, she endangered patients, she destroyed the careers of employees who trusted her, she lied to investors, to partners, to regulators, and to the public for the better part of a decade. She deserves to be where she is. But here is the question this story leaves open. Elizabeth Holmes did not operate in a vacuum. She operated in an ecosystem with specific rules, specific values, and specific blind spots. An ecosystem that rewarded vision over evidence, that celebrated the founder who claimed to be 10 years ahead of the science as a visionary rather than asking whether the science actually existed, that assembled the most credentialed board in Silicon Valley history and asked it to perform legitimacy rather than governance. She raised $400 million from intelligent, powerful, wealthy people who chose not to look at the actual technology, not because they were incapable of looking, but because the story was too good to want to question, because the performance was too convincing to interrupt. Because in Silicon Valley in 2013, the cardinal sin was not being wrong. The cardinal sin was not believing. One person went to prison. The system that produced her, that funded her, that placed its most prestigious names on her board and asked nothing in return, that applauded her at conferences days after the first major investigation published, that built the mythology of the visionary dropout and handed it to her like a weapon, that system is still running. It is running right now. Somewhere right now, there is a founder raising money from people who are not asking the right questions. Somewhere right now, there is a board being assembled not to govern but to signal. Somewhere right now, there are patients or customers or ordinary people at the bottom of a structure whose existence they do not know about. The question is not whether Elizabeth Holmes was a fraud. The question is, who is building the next Theranos, and whether anyone will ask the hard questions before the results start coming back wrong. October 15, 2015. John Carreyrou is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He has been investigating a company called Theranos for 8 months. He has spoken to former employees who described the technology as fiction. He has spoken to scientists who said the machine could not do what the company claimed. He has documents. He has sources. He has enough. That morning, the Wall Street Journal publishes his investigation. The headline reads, "Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology." In Palo Alto, California, a 31-year-old woman named Elizabeth Holmes reads the article. She has spent 12 years building a company valued at $9 billion. She has appeared on the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Inc. magazine. She has been called the next Steve Jobs, the first female self-made billionaire in Silicon Valley history, the woman who was going to revolutionize medicine. In 4 years, she will be in a federal courtroom. In 7 years, she will be in a federal prison. But on October 15, 2015, she is still Elizabeth Holmes, founder and CEO of Theranos. And the article has just destroyed everything. This is the story of how she built it, who helped her build it, and why the people who should have stopped her chose not to look. Elizabeth Holmes was 19 years old when she dropped out of Stanford. This is the detail her mythology was built on. The fearless young woman who walked away from one of the most prestigious universities in the world because she had a vision too urgent to wait for a degree. The vision was this: what if you could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood taken with a finger prick instead of a needle? What if the results could be delivered in hours instead of days? What if this technology could be made so cheap and so accessible that anyone anywhere could know everything about their own health for almost nothing? It was a genuinely beautiful idea. In 2003, when Holmes founded Theranos in her Stanford dorm room before she dropped out, it was the kind of idea that made people lean forward in their chairs. The problem was that it did not work. not because Holmes was ahead of her time, not because the technology needed more development, but because the specific claim she was making, that a single drop of blood from a finger prick could reliably run the full range of diagnostic tests that medical laboratories run on large venous blood samples, was not scientifically achievable with the technology she was building. The scientists she hired knew this, the engineers who worked on the machines knew this, the medical laboratory professionals who understood the underlying chemistry knew this. Elizabeth Holmes either did not know it, or she knew it and chose to continue anyway. The evidence that emerged at her trial suggests the second. By 2013, Theranos had raised over $400 million from investors, not from venture capital firms. Holmes had deliberately avoided venture capital because venture capital firms conduct due diligence. They send scientists to examine the technology, they ask questions that require technical answers, they look at the actual data. Holmes instead raised money from private investors, from wealthy individuals and family offices who were investing on the basis of vision, of story, of the overwhelming force of Elizabeth Holmes as a personality in a room. She was, by every account of everyone who ever met her, extraordinary in a room. She had cultivated a specific persona down to its smallest details. The black turtleneck, a direct visual reference to Steve Jobs, which she wore every single day without exception. The artificially deepened voice, significantly lower than her natural speaking voice, which she maintained in every interview and every meeting for years. The unblinking eye contact that multiple investors and journalists described as unsettling in its intensity. The language of revolution and destiny and changing the world that she deployed with the precision of someone who had studied exactly what powerful men wanted to hear from a young woman asking them for money. And then there was the board she assembled. This is where the story becomes something other than a simple story about a con artist. By 2013, the Theranos board of directors included George Shultz, former United States Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, former United States Secretary of State, James Mattis, then a retired four-star general who would later serve as Secretary of Defense, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Riley Bechtel, chairman of the Bechtel Group, Richard Kovacevic, former chief executive of Wells Fargo. The most credentialed board in Silicon Valley history. Not one of them was a scientist. Not one of them had a background in medical technology, laboratory science, or diagnostic medicine. Not one of them was positioned to evaluate whether what Holmes was telling them was true. And not one of them asked for an independent scientific evaluation of the technology before lending their names and their reputations to the company. They were not stupid men. They were some of the most powerful men in American institutional life. But they had been assembled not to govern a company, but to perform legitimacy, to make Theranos look so credible that the next investor, the next partner, the next journalist would assume that someone else had already asked the hard questions. Nobody had asked the hard questions. In 2013, Theranos partnered with Walgreens to offer its blood tests to the general public in Arizona. Real patients, real diagnoses, real medical decisions made on the basis of results produced by machines that did not work as claimed. The Theranos device, internally called the Edison, was capable of running only a small fraction of the tests the company offered. The majority of patient samples were being processed on conventional third-party laboratory equipment, the same equipment used by every other laboratory in the country, while Theranos told patients their results came from its revolutionary, proprietary technology. And the results themselves were unreliable. Internal quality control data that emerged during the federal investigation showed that Theranos test results had error rates significantly higher than industry standards. Patients received false positives for conditions they did not have, readings that told healthy people they were sick, readings that told sick people they were healthy. Doctors made treatment decisions based on Theranos numbers. Patients made life decisions based on Theranos numbers. Elizabeth Holmes knew the machines were producing unreliable results. Internal communications introduced as evidence at her trial showed she had been informed of the quality control problems repeatedly. She continued to expand the Walgreens partnership. She continued to raise money. She continued to tell investors and partners and patients that Theranos was revolutionizing medicine. The patients in Walgreens locations across Arizona who trusted a finger prick and a small machine with their health were the people at the bottom of a structure that existed at its foundation to make Elizabeth Holmes wealthy and powerful. They were not mentioned in the Forbes profiles. They were not in the conference speeches. They were the part of the story that the story required you not to think about. The Wall Street Journal investigation that published on October 15, 2015, was the beginning of the end, but not the end itself. Holmes' response to the article was not contrition, it was aggression. She appeared on CNBC the same day the article published and called the investigation a collection of lies. She went on stage at a healthcare conference days later and told the audience that this, meaning the criticism, the investigation, the questions, is what happens when you work to change things. First, they think you are crazy, then they fight you, then you change the world. The audience applauded. For nearly a year after the Wall Street Journal investigation, Holmes continued to operate Theranos, continued to raise concerns about the investigation, continued to maintain the performance. But John Carreyrou kept reporting, former employees kept talking, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services began its own investigation and found deficiencies so serious it moved to revoke Theranos' laboratory certification. The Securities and Commission opened an investigation. The Department of Justice opened an investigation. In June 2016, Theranos was banned from operating clinical laboratories for 2 years. The ban was effectively a death sentence for the company. In September 2018, Elizabeth Holmes and her former partner, Ramesh Balwani, were indicted on federal wire fraud charges. In January 2022, after a trial that lasted 4 months, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud. In November 2022, she was sentenced to 11 and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to a federal facility in Bryan, Texas in May 2023. The company that had once been valued at $9 billion was worth nothing. The technology that was going to revolutionize medicine had never worked. The $400 million raised from investors was gone. Ramesh Balwani was convicted on 12 counts of fraud and sentenced to nearly 13 years in federal prison. George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, James Mattis, Richard Kovacevic, the board that had performed legitimacy for a machine that did not work, the men whose names told the world that someone credible had already looked at this company and found it worthy of their reputation. Not one of them was charged with anything. Elizabeth Holmes is in federal prison in Bryan, Texas. She was, by any measure, a fraud. She raised money under false pretenses, she endangered patients, she destroyed the careers of employees who trusted her, she lied to investors, to partners, to regulators, and to the public for the better part of a decade. She deserves to be where she is. But here is the question this story leaves open. Elizabeth Holmes did not operate in a vacuum. She operated in an ecosystem with specific rules, specific values, and specific blind spots. An ecosystem that rewarded vision over evidence, that celebrated the founder who claimed to be 10 years ahead of the science as a visionary rather than asking whether the science actually existed, that assembled the most credentialed board in Silicon Valley history and asked it to perform legitimacy rather than governance. She raised $400 million from intelligent, powerful, wealthy people who chose not to look at the actual technology, not because they were incapable of looking, but because the story was too good to want to question, because the performance was too convincing to interrupt. Because in Silicon Valley in 2013, the cardinal sin was not being wrong. The cardinal sin was not believing. One person went to prison. The system that produced her, that funded her, that placed its most prestigious names on her board and asked nothing in return, that applauded her at conferences days after the first major investigation published, that built the mythology of the visionary dropout and handed it to her like a weapon, that system is still running. It is running right now. Somewhere right now, there is a founder raising money from people who are not asking the right questions. Somewhere right now, there is a board being assembled not to govern but to signal. Somewhere right now, there are patients or customers or ordinary people at the bottom of a structure whose existence they do not know about. The question is not whether Elizabeth Holmes was a fraud. The question is who is building the next Theranos, and whether anyone will ask the hard questions before the results start coming back wrong.